Good morning, everyone. Could I welcome you all to today's meeting of the Public-Petitions-Committee? And as always, can I ask everyone to switch off any mobile phones or electronic devices because it does interfere with our sound systems. We've also apologies today from Chick Brewery. And if I could move to agenda item 1, PE 1098 and PE 1223 on school bus safety. The first item of business today is evidence on the petitions on school bus safety. And as previously agreed, the committee will hear from the Minister of Transport and Veterans, Mr Keith Brown, thank you for coming along, and Graham Thompson, who's one of his officials. Could also point out that we've got additional paper from Ron Beattie, if staff, if members want to relate to that. And there is a possibility that Stuart Stevenson, who's got an interest in these petitions, may also come along depending on how late his other committee is running. So can I welcome the Minister and ask if he could make some brief opening remarks. I'll start with some questions, then my colleagues will ask some additional. Mr Brown.
Thank you very much, Convener, and I will be brief because we have discussed this before. Maybe just a general update and one or two comments about where we started in this. The Government, as you'll know, commissioned the Transport Research Laboratory, TRL, to carry out a review of the guide to improving school transport, which was originally published back in December 2010. That review was published in February 2013 after we had a look at it. And one of the findings of the review was that the local authorities were keen to work together on best practice and to share knowledge. And so from that point we ran 2 workshops for local authorities in September and October. And one of the themes which emerged was a desire for consistency of approach, and so we are considering issuing standard guidance to local authorities on suggested minimum standards for school bus contracts and the development of a model behavioural code of conduct between local authorities and also involving pupils and parents as well. On signage and lighting, responsibility for that is reserved to the UK Government, which is not minded to consider introducing strengthened legislation in those areas. However, we are aware of the various pilot schemes on school bus safety, especially in the north east of Scotland, including Aberdeenshire Council's development of the new school bus signage. The Government is currently considering whether to assist Aberdeenshire Council with a full evaluation of some of the initiatives that they've undertaken, and thereafter to consider whether we should develop these on a national basis. In relation to seatbelts, in December 2012 we commissioned MVA Consultancy to produce a report on the costs and challenges of changing specifications for school transport, and an Excel-based costings model allows for testing and changing assumptions to test new policy options should they arise. And that work, the commissioned work with MVA Consultancy, was completed in mid-July. We took some time after that to understand the detail underpinning the model, and after interrogation and testing of that model, officials met with COSLA and the Association of Transport Coordinating Officers to verify the costs and to discuss those findings. The Government is considering its final policy position prior to an approach being made to the UK Government to request devolution of powers on dedicated school transport and associated measures similar to those already devolved to the Welsh Assembly. And in the meantime, officials have been in contact with officials in Wales to discuss responsibility for ensuring that seatbelts on dedicated school transport, once introduced, are worn. The UK Government has confirmed that it's not prepared to devolve construction and use regulations which would allow us to make prescriptions in terms of the design of vehicles. Therefore, even after the relevant powers were devolved, we wouldn't be in a position at that stage to specify that 3-point seat belts must be fitted. And I would say, just in conclusion, there has been substantial progress amongst local authorities. Probably the best performing authority in that respect would be Highlands, which is the majority of its school transport fitted with 3-point seat belts and the rest fitted with lap belts as well. But it is a variable picture across the country.
Thank you much, Mr Brown, for the comments. I think you've touched on your statement as some of the questions I was going to ask, but in terms of the devolution aspects, I understand the procedure is an order in council in order to get devolution for the points that you're after. What would the timescale for that procedure be?
Well, there's an internal procedure within the Government through its Cabinet subcommittee to discuss the approach first of all, but I think we're just at the stage just now, we're well aware of that process. We're at the stage now of fixing on the costs, and I think the reason for that is the costs will largely fall on local authorities, and we don't want to do something which either disadvantages local authorities disproportionately or has an impact on those small bus operating companies which provide the majority of the contracts for local authorities. So those things are being considered. It will then be a case of going to the Cabinet subcommittee and agreeing the approach to the Westminster Government.
So how frequent, when you say, is your contact with your equivalent in the UK government?
Well, it's been periodic. I mean, the relevant ministers changed quite a number of times, but the key contact was with Mike Penning, as you may remember, who agreed in principle to the idea of the devolution of those powers. However, it is a slightly different situation in Scotland as compared with Wales. But as I say, we did want to make sure, first of all, that we had the right information as to what the cost would be, and one thing we're looking very seriously at is whether the staged introduction such that existing contracts wouldn't have to be rewritten or changed, which is a very expensive thing to do for local authorities, and difficult also for the bus operating companies to retrofit quickly the seat belts. You'll also be aware that there's legislation from the Westminster Government on disabilities, which requires changes in buses right through to 2019. So there is quite an agenda for change and improvement in bus services, and I think we're trying to make sure that that's managed as best as it can be in the interests of local authorities, school safety obviously, and the bus operators.
Mr Beattie, who's in the gallery, should welcome him, mentioned in his additional paper, I think yesterday, that he mentioned the toolkit that the government is looking at. Has that toolkit been updated recently?
I think we're still working on that, but perhaps Graham could mention something about that.
The toolkit that I referred to is the contained in the review in the Guide to School Transport, which was published in 2010 and 2013. We reviewed that toolkit in February, and the TRL produced a report for us, which led to the workshops that the Minister mentioned earlier that we held in September and October. And as a result of that, TRL have produced some recommendations for us that were currently just produced since we've just held the workshops that we're looking to consider taking forward as a result of that.
Angus MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Minister. In your letter of the 18th of April this year, you stated that workshops were being developed to share best practice on school bus safety between local authorities. Is it possible to give us an update on how these are going?
The last answer partly covers that, but also, as I've said, Aberdeenshire has been very much to the fore, and what we've agreed to do is to evaluate the initiatives, the pilots which they've had, and at that point then to issue that to other local authorities to say this is best practice, if you like, and people can follow this best practice.
David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. What are the key barriers to improving school bus safety, and what costs have been identified to change and make improvements, and how does the Scottish Government intend to take it forward?
Well, in relation to the seatbelt provision, that's the big ticket item, if you like, in terms of costs, and we have done some work on those costs, and one of the reasons for it taking a bit longer than we would have hoped is that we did go out and ask local authorities who are best placed to provide the indicative cost for this, and it's fairly safe to say we didn't get a huge response, which is why we then moved on to the MVA consultancy. I can give you the detail of the actual costs that we have identified so far, although they very much depend on when contracts are being renewed. If a local authority is coming up to a point where they're about to renew their contracts for their school bus transport, and sometimes these are done over a period of 3 years, then it's much easier to make that change at less cost at the point of the change of the contract. They do rise significantly. Some of the estimates that we have for the rollout of 3-point belts would be between £15 and £16 million for the entire fleet, and lap belts between £7 and £7.5 million. But these are pretty variable. The national costs, if we can do this in a stage way, would be much easier to cope with. So perhaps £200,000 per annum, and possibly an initial cost of £500,000. Now, the Welsh Government, when they looked at this, just addressed this by making sure that local authorities had enough notice beforehand so they could manage this process without incurring additional costs, and that's what we would seek to do as well.
I can just throw another question to you just before I bring in Mr Wilson. I think what the petitioner is saying to us is that this petition has been around since 2007, and what I'm picking up quite clearly from Mr Beattie is a real frustration that there's no one's doubting the good intentions of the government, obviously, on this issue. What it's about is just frustration that things keep getting talked about but we don't have the specific action. Have you a specific timetable for action for us? I think that's where the frustration is coming from the petitioner.
Well, I think the It's made clear, I think at least on 2 occasions, that we don't intend to seek legislation in terms of the petition to take this forward. What we're trying to do is through guidance, so that will take longer, but we've made a position very clear on this a number of times, not in relation to the seatbelt, that's been more of a changing situation, but in relation to signing and lining and some of the initiatives. We've said that we wouldn't support, for example, a ban on overtaking at school buses for various reasons, which I've said to the committee before. So the government's position on this hasn't changed, and it's been fairly explicitly stated a number of times. There is further work that we can do. It's also worth saying that in the meantime, what we're seeing are record low levels of statistics. Still, last year, for example, 2 children died. Couldn't be attributed, I don't think, directly to wearing of seatbelts, but 2 children died. And across the whole country, 2 child fatalities, it was down from 3 the year before. And since 2002, you're talking about a huge reduction in the number of injuries. So local authorities are doing work, and that's a continuous process. So there's not an end point to this, no. I think we have said we're not going to be legislating in terms of some of the things mentioned in the petition, such as overtaking. But the signing and lining and marking is something that local authorities have responsibility for, and all we can do in that situation, and what we're seeking to do, is to give guidance to try and make sure that best practice is developed throughout the country.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. In your opening statement, you made reference to the fact the UK Government weren't minded to transfer powers in terms of the construction and use of buses. Did the UK Government give any reason why they weren't minded to transfer these powers to the Scottish Government?
I'd have to check, because it's been so long ago they said that to us, and it often is the case that these things, it's just a straightforward either no, or we just don't hear back from them sometimes. In relation to seatbelts, it was different, but we got a positive response from Mike Penning, but I'd have to check exactly how they expressed that, whether it was just done through officials or in writing, but they've made it very clear to us they won't.
As you're aware, Minister, we have 2 petitions running side by side on this issue. One is about the seatbelts, another one is about safety signage on transport, school transport. And one of the suggestions within that petition is about new lighting system, or a system that on the buses that can actually indicate when the buses are stopping, when they're dropping passengers off, when they're picking passengers up, to try and restrict the issue about vehicles overtaking school buses as they are parked to pick up and drop off children. So, in relation to, it would be useful for the committee, I think, if we could get some of the indications, or if there is a reason given by the UK Government why they felt it wasn't relevant at that time, because it is an issue that petitioners raised, and it would be useful to try and get clarification on that. But moving on, Minister, one of the issues, I know we've spoken about local authorities, as local authorities let the contracts for school transport. But one of the issues I raised recently with one of my local authorities in the region, they indicated that they didn't directly let the contracts. Their contracts were let through Strathclyde Partnership for Transport, and they basically referred me on to Strathclyde Partnership for Transport as the body that regulate the condition and any fittings that are contained within the school bus system. Has there been any, I know there's been a lot of discussion with local authorities, has there been any discussion with Strathclyde Partnership for Transport?
There would have been discussion with them. We've had discussion with all the regional transport partnerships, and Strathclyde's a bit different from the others, and they have the role that you've mentioned there. If you like, actively carry on that role for local authorities, where in other regional transport partnerships it's much more of a coordinating or overseeing role. And in some ways that makes it easier to deal with in Strathclyde, because you can deal with one body rather than having to talk to all the different councils. So we have discussed that with regional transport partnerships, although just recently we're looking at the idea of whether, in trying to get a better idea in each area of what's actually done. I mean, I think, if you like, the level has been topped up. The number of buses now which are fitted with seatbelts, to go back to, I know there's 2 different petitions, is increasing all the time, the proportion of them. And to get a better idea of what the nature of what remains, we reckon it's around 500 plus buses still requiring fitting. We have had that, but we've looked at the issue of trying to use the RTPs to see if we can get them to do the monitoring and also the assessment, so we know when we reach the 100%, if you like, in terms of seatbelts. And there has been discussion with RTPs, yes.
Minister, you also made reference in your opening remarks about the £15 million for 3-point seat belts and £7 million for lap seat belts. My understanding is some local authorities throughout Scotland have set aside budgets to enable the fitting of seat belts. Now, within the figures that you quoted earlier, the 15 million and the 7 million, do you know how much local authorities have set aside to enable contractors to actually, or assist contractors, fit seat belts to school transport?
It's not there. It's obviously that information would be for local authorities, but perhaps if we look at the exercise of trying to involve the regional transport partnerships, we could look at that information. But in the end, discretion over that would still fall to local authorities whether they wanted to use that money for that purpose. And we have had one eye on the fact, of course, that with the recession we've just gone through, that we know local authorities are stretched for finance, and they, as you know, under the Concordat have discretion as to how they allocate funds. So we know it's a difficult situation, and we do think the best way to address it, the most cost-effective way as well, is to try and do this in a staged way. There are very many small companies which provide school bus transport, which would find it very difficult to quickly either retrofit or replace their stock. So we are trying to manage that process. But we don't have, to answer your question directly, the information on what individual local authorities may have set aside for this.
Thank the Minister for that response. But, Minister, it might be useful in your discussions with the RTPs to ask them whether or not local authorities in their area have set aside budget for the fitting of seat belts in school transport, and whether or not the contractors, the providers of the school transport, are actually taking up those budgets or making demands on those budgets, because it's easy enough for a local authority to say they've set a couple of £100,000 aside for the fitting of seat belts, but if the people providing the school transport don't understand or realise that that money is available, then they might not be applying for it. So it's just trying to tidy up, and whether or not local authorities are making it known that there is money available to assist them to fit seat belts where necessary.
Happy to try and see what information we can get on that for the committee. I would say, though, some authorities may have it in that way you've described as a pot of money to which operators can bid into, but other authorities will simply make extra provision for a contract which will be more expensive if they specify that the buses should have these 3-point seat belts fitted. The other thing we did look at was the idea of any whether it's possible to assist local authorities. We have the Green Bus Fund and the Bus Investment Fund, although used for mainstream bus services. But it's also the case that, as well as the need to have seat belts on these buses, they're often the oldest buses in the fleet, if you like, and environmentally some of the most damaging. So if you can try, we've looked at trying to develop a scheme whereby we could provide assistance if the change was made in terms of environmentally, hybrid buses and so on, and at the same time making sure the new buses were fitted with seat belts. Again, the big issue there is finance, and instead what we've done most recently is to allocate monies to community transport organisations for new buses. But that is something we've looked at.
Thank you very much, Minister.
Anne McTaggart.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Just really to ask, have the Transport Scotland officials kept the petitioners informed of the developments that have been happening over the years?
Well, I know for certain that Graham and others have been in touch with Mr Beattie, and I couldn't say in relation to the other petition, but Graham would know.
I haven't had any recent contact with Lynn Merrifield, certainly in this year, and I can't remember, looking back in the records, I've only been in post this year, so I would have to look back to check when the last time that Miss Merrifield was spoken to.
Would there be any difficulty if that was to happen, given that the petitioner has been proactively campaigning on this specific issue since 2007? Would that be an unreasonable request that happens?
I think we can take that up. I suppose maybe the assumption has been that this regularly features in the newspapers, but that's an indirect way of keeping people updated. No, we'd have no problems with getting in touch with Ms Merrifield to make her aware of the latest developments.
That's great, because through some of the correspondence that has been that we have received as a committee, and I think one of the most kind of striking paragraphs, sorry if that's okay if I can read that out, every school child throughout Scotland has the same right to be protected. One local authority area should not be safer than another. Every school child has the same right of safety. And I think that's important, that given that Mr Beattie has been, and also the other campaigner, they have been campaigning proactively on this issue, and feel fairly passionate about this issue. It would be great to keep him on board to follow this through.
I think there has been that regular contact with Mr Beattie. I'm not sure it's true in relation to Ms Merrifield, but we'll make sure it's done with Ms Merrifield as well. I mean, Graham's had, I think, pretty lengthy conversations very recently with Mr Beattie on this as well, and I think it's worth just putting on the record the extent to which we appreciate the efforts that Mr Beattie's made, and I think there's no question it's driven the response to this important issue. It's something which many people across the country, my own kids went to school in a double-decker bus which didn't have seat belts for many years, and it's a very important issue, and I think Mr Beattie's done a great job in forcing us to confront it.
Thanks, Minister.
We've still got a little bit of time if any of our members wish to put further points or questions to the Minister. No? If not, then our next point, as you'll know, Ministers, we need to consideration of action and options for this petition. Members will know that the clerk has outlined possible options. The first is to defer consideration until the new year and seek an update for the Scottish Government in terms of what action is taken in the publication of the report by Transport Scotland, or secondly, to any other action which the committee considers appropriate. I think it certainly makes sense to continue the petition until we've got some action. Obviously, we want to go the extra mile for both petitioners in this point. But John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Could I also suggest we write to the UK Government again to seek clarification on the reasons behind the decision not to transfer the regulatory powers to the Scottish Government, as clearly if the construction and use regulations remain with the UK Government, then it ties the hands of the Scottish Government in relation to fulfilling the wishes of the petitioners in regard to moving forward with school transport. So it may be useful just to write asking for further clarification, and also get clarification for the Minister as well in relation to any deliberations that have taken place with the UK Government. But just to remind them, and I think it would be useful to remind them, we did have a Minister from the UK Government before this committee who assured us almost 3 years ago that there would be no problem transferring the regulations over to the Scottish Government, and it would be useful just to get clarification on that.
Jackson Carlo.
I think we're now confusing two quite separate things. I think this degree of common sense applies. We can't have vehicles across the UK all built to different construction standards. And I think it's very likely that the reason in which the particular aspect of this that we're now talking about has not been devolved is for that simple reason. I think manufacturers and operators would find that an extremely difficult provision to adhere to. That is quite different to the matter that Mike Penning was happy to see devolved to the Scottish Parliament.
John Wilson, do you want to come back in?
Well, at the moment, Convener.
Right, thank you. Do other members have any points? Are members agreeable then that we have the course of action, we defer publication of this? And obviously Jackson Carr made an interesting point about standardisation across the UK. And notwithstanding that, I think, is it still worth us writing to the UK Minister to get some clarification of timescale?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you for that. Well, we're obviously going to continue with this petition, Minister, as you've heard, and can I thank yourself, Minister, and Mr Thompson for coming along and giving evidence today. And again, thanks Mr Beattie for all his work on this petition. It's, I think the committee do appreciate all your efforts, Mr Beattie. Thank you very much. And I'll defer for 2 minutes to allow witnesses to leave. Thank you all. Restart our committee, and we're on agenda item 2. So the next item of business is consideration of 2 new petitions. As previously agreed, the committee will take evidence from both petitioners. The first new petition is PE 1493 by Peter John Gordon on the Sunshine Act for Scotland. Members of a note by the clerk, the spice briefing, the petition and the submission from the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. Can I welcome the petitioner, Mr Gordon? Thank you for coming along, and we're a little bit early, so I appreciate you being on time. Can I invite Mr Gordon to make a short presentation of no more than 5 minutes, and then we'll kick off with some questions. Mr Gordon.
Thank you very much. I'm here to present a petition calling on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to implement a Sunshine Act that will make it mandatory that all payments, gifts and hospitality from the manufacturers of drugs, nutritional supplements, medical devices and healthcare technology to NHS Scotland healthcare workers are reported, logged and kept in a publicly open database. The database should also include all sponsored education of healthcare workers and managers and should quantify the sums of money or cash equivalent of payments in kind that are involved. I believe the Scottish Government could lead the way in the UK on this issue. Just a bit of background. My son has type 1 diabetes and is on insulin, has had that since the age of 12. And I'm very much an evidence-based doctor, and in reference to that, I just want to make it very clear that I support the pharmaceutical industry fully. Indeed, one of Scotland's undeclared heroes was Dr MacLeod, who was a co-inventor of insulin back in 1923 and got the Nobel Prize. And another one of our great scientists, is one of my heroes, is James Clerk Maxwell, who without today we wouldn't be able to communicate in the way that we're doing. So I say this as background. Conflicts of interest feature daily in the news and indeed in many different areas, as we all know. I believe healthcare should not see itself as immune from conflicts of interest. Robert K. Merton was somebody that commentated in the 1970s as an academic about the loss of disinterestedness, and this has become a much discussed problem in scientific journals. Robert K. Merton was interested in the ways that the cultural structure of science guarantees scientific objectivity. And this is my main concern today, that I believe in evidence-based science, and I want it to be as objective as possible. Disinterestedness is the assumption that scientists are not influenced by personal material gain, that their reward lies in recognition by their peers. I would suggest that this situation has changed quite significantly over the last few decades. So just briefly to say that I've been looking at this area for a few years now and have been confused myself about what regulations and guidance are around. Initially, in contacting the Scottish Government, I was told that NHS board should be following a common understanding 2012, working together for patients, guidance on joint working between NHS Scotland and the pharmaceutical industry. However, within that document, I was forwarded that by the Scottish Government. It made it clear that this excluded research, procurement and sponsorship, so it excludes quite a lot. Within that document, the reader was directed to NHS Circular MEL 1994-48, Standards of Business Conduct for NHS Staff. This is now 20 years old. I wrote again to the government and saying that, and had a recent helpful reply from the Cabinet Secretary of Health and Wellbeing on the 31st of October. And he told me about, this is a quote, HDL 2003-62 made it clear that all health boards should establish a register of interest for all NHS employees. I would say that the key word there is should. And here we've got two guidances. That one is 20 years old, pre-devolution, and the other is 10 years. So Alex Neil went on to say, in addition, healthcare professionals will continue to be bound by the codes and standards of the regulators and professions. Current Scottish appraisal form for consultants and doctors like myself ask doctors to confirm, this is on an annual basis, I confirm that I've complied with the conflict of interest mechanisms of the board within I work. So this leads to me the research that I've done under freedom of information to all 22 NHS boards in Scotland. And I can confirm, as I've found, there is none of the 22 NH boards have a completely open access, routinely populated central register for recording interests as per the HDL guidance of 10 years ago. A few boards do have a register, but the completion is patchy. And the board closest to the requested HDL 2003-62 stated, however, the information is not routinely collated, and that was the one that was closest. The rest of them, there isn't routine collation of the details. So basically, we do not know which doctor gets paid what, and there is no way of finding out. Last year, for the first time, it was revealed across the UK, 40 million was paid to healthcare workers in the UK by the pharmaceutical industry. An estimate has been made that 4 million of that to Scottish healthcare workers. This does not seem to appear in the registers that are in existence in Scotland just now. My concern as an evidence-based doctor is about maximising benefit and minimising harm, and for resources to go where they're most needed in medical care. So harm is where I'm going to finish. I think the scale of this might slightly amaze you. That's a quote from Dr. Ben Goldacre. 3/4 of guideline panellists have today ties to industry. This is a recent report in the BMJ. A recent study by the Ethical Standards in Health and Life Sciences concluded that 89% of 1,056 respondents agreed that payments to individually named healthcare professionals by companies should be transparent. So that was 89%. This is important because much of the continuing medical education in the UK and in Scotland is by key opinion leaders, and I became interested in this through our vulnerable elders in the area of dementia. America have now introduced a Sunshine Act. France and Australia seem set to follow. Where harm comes from is the misleading promotion of continuing medical education and products. My wife and I, both NHS medical practitioners for 20 years, each went through the BNF for examples of misleading drug marketing where the potential for harm was underestimated. In every chapter we found obvious examples. This result of marketing education rather than scientific objectivity, where benefits are maximised and harms are not fully represented. So 4 million may not seem a lot in terms of the budget for medicines, but the inverse care law is around, and that if we are seeing repeated examples of harm, those who most need it will not get the treatment that they should be getting based on objective science. So I just want to conclude just with a few examples, because I think it's important to give you an idea that this is across my area of expertise is in psychiatry, and particularly of our elderly. But my wife is a GP, so I wanted to cover all areas. So this will just take just a minute or two. Chapter 1 of the BNF is on gastrointestinal disorders. Cisapride was most commonly used for gastroesophageal reflux, including in infants. It was withdrawn from the market in 2000 because of the risk of cardiac arrhythmia. Each of these is an example where the drug has been promoted by involvement of pharmaceutical industry, and the benefits have been promoted first and the harms have later appeared. Chapter 2, cardiovascular. There's a very recent example. The new oral anticoagulants are safer, in inverted commas, than warfarin. Extra warnings have now been issued as these drugs still increase the risk of bleeding and, unlike warfarin, have no antidote. Chapter 4, the central nervous system. There are so many examples here, it would be impossible to list them all, but there's paroxetine, reboxetine, pregabalin. Pregabalin is a painkiller that has been widely promoted with big awareness campaigns and lots of educational meetings about neuropathic pain. These drugs are now commonly sought for abuse. Chapter 5, I'm just about finished. Overuse of antibiotics and appropriate use of antibiotics may well be an area of this, and probably most people will be aware of the Tamiflu debate, which only shortens any influenza illness by half a day, probably also has the risk of making you sick, and huge quantities of unpublished data have still not been released. Chapter 5, endocrine. The glitazones in diabetes, strongly marked with lots of educational meetings. Use is now declining because of the association with heart failure and bladder cancer. Hormone replacement therapy. When long-term studies demonstrate that proposed cardiovascular benefits of hormone replacement therapy appeared in fact to be harms, marketing of these products virtually disappeared overnight. The marketing bill for the pharmaceutical industry is twice that of the amount they spend on innovation. Chapter 7, just 3 more examples. Chapter 7 in obstetrics and gynecology. Oxybutynin, I come across this area, is used for urinary frequency and incontinence. It's now been shown to have risk of cognitive impairment, especially in our elderly, which is now being currently used for the basis for marking for other, newer, still under patent drugs of the same class. Vioxx is an example of a drug that was used for musculoskeletal and joint disease, and it was withdrawn from the market. And following that, a rival firm were very quick to push their product, Celebrex. Significant warnings are now attached to use of this. The class of drugs was marketed as causing fewer GI side effects than older drugs. However, they have increased cardiovascular risks, and the scandal around the fact that trials had shown this but were not published was one of the first steps towards the Sunshine Act in the USA. So I'll finish my evidence there, but I strongly believe that the solution is not to, I'm absolutely not arguing to outlaw conflicts of interest, they're part of life, but to insist on transparency. I believe sunshine is a powerful disinfectant, and the way that we should start doing this, there's a number of ways we can go about it, but Scotland could lead the way by introducing a Sunshine Act. Thank you.
Thanks for your evidence, Dr Gordon. You did mention in your opening remarks about the important international examples, such as in America, for example. Can you say a little bit more about the international examples and what lessons perhaps we can learn in Scotland from these?
I'm definitely not an expert in the area. That would be the first thing I would like to say, but I'm aware that since August of this year, America introduced a Sunshine Act, and now if you look online, you can get stories are emerging because it's now mandatory that payments to doctors, particularly key opinion leaders, are published in an open access database, and indeed anybody can look that up on a website called Dollars for Docs. And it's quite staggering the amount of money that's involved, not across the board in healthcare professionals, but a number of key individuals who are targeted as key opinion leaders who get paid really very significant sums. And if you follow the stories through each of these key opinion leaders, you find that there has been, as well as benefits from medication, there's been underreporting of harms of the medication. And the main issue here is that, returning to Scotland here, the mainstay of continuing medical education, i.e. once you've graduated as a doctor, is sponsored through the pharmaceutical industry. And the medical profession have taken the notion that we can be more objective and can rise above this, the potential of marketing. But I would say that I would argue, and along with that scientific objectivity should be presented first, and all that data should be available. We should know about the conflicts of interest. They should be open, recorded on an annual basis, and should be mandatory. And I think there's several levels that we need there, not just a Sunshine Act, but we're also hoping to convince the General Medical Council that this could be a regular part of the appraisal system, so that doctors record the payments or any sponsored education of any sort.
My second question relates to the UK legislation. You know that the 2010 Bribery Act makes it an offence to take bribes in return for services of any sorts in public service or anywhere else, for example. I know it's a very hard question to answer, but are you suggesting that within the NHS in Scotland there actually is breaches of the Bribery Act because of the interaction between pharmacy companies and doctors across the board in Scotland?
No, I'm not suggesting that, and I don't know much about that Act. I'm just merely commenting that the evidence shown from the Freedom of Information returns that are recent across all 22 NHS boards in Scotland show that transparency is talked about, but it's not happening. It's just not happening.
John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr Gordon. Mr Gordon, in your opening remarks, you made reference to marketing budgets in comparison to research and development budgets, but you've then just there said about the sponsorship issues. And how would you envisage any legislation being put through that can separate out what is legitimate marketing of a drug, the research undertaken to make that drug suitable for use, and the sponsorship?
It's a good question. I think it's relatively straightforward, actually. I'm surprised it's not happened already. We just need an open central register where you record payments from the pharmaceutical industry. Conflicts of interest go far wider, and we all understand that, but this would be the starting point. And that America has decided that this is the right route, and France and Australia considering it too, I think says a lot. We can't, there was I got a copy of the reply from the ABPI that was sent to the committee, and it was very useful and helpful. But in my opinion, we can't totally rely on outside agencies ensuring that this happens. They provided a lot of information with this European code. But having read it, I'm not convinced that that will meet the standards of a Sunshine Act. And I think we need the Sunshine Act as the background, the GMC to regulate across the UK for this to happen on a regular basis, and for an open register to happen. It would be good for us all. We could then, this inverse care law, we could make sure that the resources on our medical prescribing goes to those who most need it, and that the lessons from history, we've got so many lessons from history, even in my short time in medicine, you know, from overprescribing. I believe in antidepressants, I believe in antipsychotic medications, but I want them prescribed appropriately to those who most need. And if you have education that is marketed, the risk is that that doesn't happen. And actually, the benefits are presented and the harms aren't, and usually there's a combination of those.
Mr Gordon, that's interesting in terms of the market-led educational opportunities that there may be in the industry, given the indication that the drugs that are in use or most common use may be the ones that are actually sold better, either through the marketing and the training and facilities that are available to doctors. In terms of the ABPI paper that you've referred to and the recommendations that they've made, you've indicated that you don't think that goes far enough, and you do think there should be a register kept by NHS boards, or is it NHS boards, or is it NHS Scotland? And would you envisage the crossover between the two registers? Because according to European pharmaceutical industry, they're talking about setting up a register anyway. But how would that, or how would you envisage any register being kept by the pharmaceutical industry being tied into any register being kept by either NHS boards or NHS Scotland?
I think we should have both. There's absolutely nothing. We've had legislation, the MEL 48, it's been around 20 years pre-devolution, that says boards, NHS boards should have hospitality registers. They don't, 2 decades. And just recently, that I finally confirmed from the Scottish Government that there's actually another piece of legislation, that this HDL 2062, which was in 2003, so that's been 10 years, and we don't have functioning hospitality registers. I think this is really quite shocking. And I think we should be doing that now. NHS board should be doing that now, and then any measures to do a national collected database can happen in addition to that. I don't see any problem with that.
Mr. Gordon, you make reference to the medical profession and the role of the medical profession, but one of the issues that has come up recently is the prescribing of drugs by GPs, but then when a patient takes the prescription along to a pharmacist, the pharmacist then can change that drug to a similar drug but a different manufacturer. Would you envisage pharmacists being included in this register?
At this stage, I was just envisioning this for healthcare workers as part of the NHS, but I think we do need to see it across the board, so it's a good point you're making.
Jackson Carlo.
Morning. Mr. Gordon, I have a number of questions in a variety of different ways. First of all, you listed some drugs in your opening remarks. I take it these are all SMC NICE approved products. I think it would be cautious that you made some suggestions about those drugs, which I don't think the committee should, in accepting your evidence, say that we are endorsing, because I think that would be inappropriate. I'm just, there is this register that's coming from within the pharmaceutical industry. What do you envisage the cost of the register you're proposing would be?
I'm just a doctor. I don't know about costs, so I can absolutely...
I mean, have you given thought to how it would operate? Who would sustain it? Who would be responsible for it? What penalties would obtain? Last week, for example, we had the Healthcare Scotland Awards. Tables were hosted. Nurses and other healthcare workers were rewarded. Would everybody who'd been at a table have been required to get onto this register, in your view, if they'd been hosted, say, by a pharmaceutical company, to record the fact that they'd been there? Is that the kind of level of detail that and the range of inclusion that you're looking for? Because you talk of all healthcare workers having to record any example of hospitality.
Starting point is just payment or payment in kind. I think that's relatively straightforward and not controversial.
Well,
it's in the spirit of transparency, of objectivity.
It is, other than if somebody doesn't. And then there has to be some sort of police force that's responsible, and then there has to be some form of inquiry into why somebody didn't, and then there has to be some form of redress or penalty, and all of that can become really quite a considerable additional burden. So I'm just wondering whether we are potentially, in having something so all-embracing, creating something of a sledgehammer which could in itself become an expensive and bureaucratic nightmare on its own account. Because I have to say that is my experience of such initiatives generally, and particularly within the NHS.
How come that the Houses of Parliament had there was scandal about payments, and and transparency was seen as a this is
for 600 people. Yeah. We're talking here about tens of thousands of people who operate within the health service in Scotland. The scale of this is way beyond the monitoring of 129 MSPs or 600 MPs. It's a very much broader proposal you're registering.
The potential for harm is significant, as history has kept showing. Repeated over-prescribing of medications that's caused a lot of harm and has diverted resource away from those who need. I don't see your problem in introducing this
It seems to me that insofar as you're talking about overprescribing, that's something, but the register you're talking about seems to me to be proposed to reach way, way beyond any potential conflict of interest arising from that to something much, much more widespread.
So just, I don't accept your argument at all. This is about...
You said that any nurse who'd been there last week should register on a site that they'd been there.
No, I've been very clear in my petition what I'm asking for, and is for payments to be recorded. And this, America has accepted this as the right way forward. I'm interested that...
Different health service they have. They don't have a national health service.
So are you defending the fact that 10 and 20 years we have no properly functioning hospitality registers? Surely that's a very easy thing to implement to start and wouldn't be very costly.
Well, you're saying surely, but you actually don't know.
Yeah, I'm not... yeah.
There was a bit of a fuss in the press recently. I think it related to the health service in England where it had been identified, when it touches a little bit on the prescribing by GPs of generic product, where it appeared that the health service was picking up a very considerable additional bill because of marketing to pharmaceutical companies through GPs to promote a particular product, even though there was a much lower cost alternative. I'm slightly confused myself here now, but my understanding is GPs are self-employed and therefore aren't employed within the NHS. So the register you're proposing wouldn't cover GPs?
Register I'm proposing would cover, it's about education. This is about continuing medical education, and when that has been, when there's payments going to doctors as key opinion leaders for that, which can rise to really considerable amounts of money, and also for training and lectures and sponsored symposia. The GMC I understand, are taking this matter very seriously and now considering implementing this as part of a regular basis. I don't see this as being, I'm not a financial expert, but I don't see this as a difficult thing to produce. I do understand that the range of the guidelines needs to be clear about what you have to declare and what you don't have to declare. But actually, the implementation of it is not difficult.
I was trying to establish, am I right that GPs aren't employed by the NHS?
Well, yeah, I think GPs are employed by the NHS, but they are private contractors.
So would this cover them?
We need to confirm that. Yeah, need to confirm that.
Thank you. Other members wish to put any questions to Dr. Gordon? No. Well, this is Dr. Gordon. If you just hold on, the next stage for us is to make decisions about where the petition goes. And members will know that we've got at least two options from the clerk. One is to seek information about the petition, for example, from the Scottish Government, the BMA, ethical standards in health and so on. Or secondly, to take any other action that members may feel appropriate. Kind of recommendations from members of the committee? John Wilson?
Thank you, Convener. I think we should continue this petition, as well as the Scottish Government, British Medical Association, Ethical Standards in Health and Life Sciences Group. Could it also suggest we contact the Royal College of Nursing, the GMC has been mentioned, NHS Scotland, possibly one or two health boards in Scotland, and also Unison, to seek their views on such a register being applied and introduced in the medical profession in Scotland.
Thank you. Other members? Jackson Carlo?
I think we should continue the petition too. I think it raises some interesting issues. We've had international comparisons drawn to our attention, and by some means I would like to know a little bit more about how those operate, the costs involved in them, what the circumstances were that led to their introduction, because I think if we are drawing parallels there, we ought to do so on an informed basis. I would find that useful.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I'm sure our colleagues in SPICE could provide some research for us for a future meeting, so I think that's an excellent point. Other members? I just wonder
also whether in this issue there is, we should potentially be also writing as Department of Health in England. The issues will be similar, and I think it would be useful to have any knowledge of any information or investigation they've done on this, which might also inform our view.
Thank you for that. Anne McTaggart?
Really, but the pharmaceutical companies as well, either chemists, pharmacies? Had that been included?
Well, there's
to
a
write
submission from the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. Would you wish something more than that? Or
given our evidence today?
Right. Thank you. Other members wish to contribute? Are members happy then with the course of action suggested by Jackson Carroll and John Wilson? Thank you very much for that. It's actually in here, Dr Gordon, then we're continuing the petition in the terms that John Wilson and Jackson Carlow have suggested. Obviously, we'll keep you up to date with developments, and thank you for coming along, and we'll let you know how this petition goes in the longer term. And I'll suspend for 2 minutes to allow our witnesses to churn around. Thank you very much. Committee, and the second new petition today is PE 1491 by Tom Minogue on secret society membership declaration by decision makers. Members have a note by the clerk, the spice briefing, the petition and a letter from the Grand Lodge of the Free and Accepted Masons of Scotland. For members' information, the previous petitions referred to in the note by the clerk and the spice briefings were Sydney Gallagher, which was PE 693, William Burns, who was PE 652, and Tom Minogue, it's PE 306. Could I welcome the petitioner, Tom Minogue? Very welcome for coming along, Mr Minogue. And also, we've got Peter Stewart Blacker, who's the convener for Accountability Scotland. Thank you for coming along as well. Clearly, if you want to intervene at any time, please indicate through himself, and be happy to hear your views. I can ask Mr Minogue if you would give us a short presentation of around maximum 5 minutes, Mr Minogue. That would be very appreciated if you could. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd begin by asking the committee to take the spice briefing paper with a pinch of salt, because it's misleading and doesn't tell half the story. And this may not be the fault of those who compiled it, because the Parliament's archives aren't very helpful to researchers. For a start, Speculative Society of Edinburgh was reported here in 2002 and not brought to the public's attention by Robbie the Pict in 2003. The all-male Specs domination of the judiciary was raised by me in this Parliament by way of a written submission in 2002, though you wouldn't know that from the Parliament's summary of Petition 306. However, the official transcript of the Justice Committee's meetings of 30th of October 2002 record this, and you can see it on my Tom Minogue blog. And it's a sad fact that I can follow public petitions in the year 1817, but not in 2003. And this is in the internet age is ridiculous. At the click of a mouse, I can access every issue of the Scotsman and the Glasgow Herald newspaper back to March 1817, and read, for example, about a petition by the Borough of Rutherglen to the Westminster Parliament. The petition proposed electoral reforms and opposed the government's suspension of habeas corpus, but I can't readily find out what happened to my own petition on the 4th of March 2003. And on the 4th of March 2003, Jim Wallace killed off my petition when he gave evidence to the Justice II Committee. He told them that Tom Minogue was almost unique, being the only one with a concern about undeclared Freemasonry in the judiciary. Now, that was an astonishing claim, given that it was made at a time when the UK government, as a condition of employment, insisted on knowing the Masonic membership status of new judges in England and Wales, and when Norway had similar rules. In effect, the Justice Minister was saying that public concern regarding judges' Masonic membership hit the buffers at Berwick-on-Tweed and East Coast ports. And the spice briefing paper isn't even handed, featuring 2 cases which United Grand Lodge of England threatened to cite for judicial review of the judge's Masonic registration regulation in England and Wales. But the 2 Italian cases were never tested in a UK court and are not relevant to my petition. Yet Spice featured them while ignoring and omitting to show a Scottish case that is absolutely relevant to my petition. A case where a Social Security Commissioner upheld the appeal of a Dundee claimant who demanded the right to know if he was being assessed by Masonic decision makers. The Commissioner held that under Article 6 of the European Convention of Human Rights, he had the right to ask. So, 2 spurious Italian cases featured by Spice, 1 highly relevant Scottish case suppressed, and I say suppressed because Spice allude to it, albeit obliquely, as additional evidence the Parliament declined to publish. And you might ask why they declined, why was the publishing censored? And the Dundee case is a publicly reported one, and it was discussed with the Justice Minister on 4th of March 2003 in connection with my petition. But you would need a super sleuth, a modern-day Sherlock Holmes, to find it in the Parliament's archives. So to conclude, I would ask the committee to look at my petition afresh, judge it on its merits. In my opinion, this would be done by way of forensic research and examination involving academics, and shouldn't rely solely on those with vested interests, judges and politicians, who, for whatever reason, might want to gloss over this issue. Jack Straw was such a politician. He promised a register of Freemason judges in an election manifesto, was instrumental in introducing it, and then as Home Secretary in 2009, not 2007 as Spice report, but in 2009 he did a U-turn and scrapped it, when, with an election looming and his party trailing in the polls, he sought to gain ground by bribing the Masonic voter. Rather, I would ask the committee to follow the example of a Scottish politician, John McCallion, the first Petitions Committee convener, who boasted that his committee never met in private. That's as it should be, true to the promise that this Scottish Parliament would be open and accountable. Too often I've watched video coverage of committee meetings where the members sit down and rubber stamp briefing papers prepared by bureaucrats, or arrive at conclusions that are the result of private meetings. Some committees remind me of TV cookery programmes, where celebrity chefs produce a perfectly cooked dish with the comment, "Here's one I prepared earlier." Fait accompli is appearing where the public see no due process. That's simply wrong. Future generations should be able to examine every step of this petition process, just as I can read the Scotsman archives and follow those petitions in 1817 which supported the Blanketeers and the Hampden Clubs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Minogue. And just for the record, to stress that obviously we invited you along today because we wanted to hear about the merits of the petition. And the reason that you're here is so that we can examine your petition and look at the next steps. And I think I can speak on behalf of my committee over the last 2 years to say that we've always been very keen to go the extra mile with every single petitioner. And you'll know that we've had a similar petition involving registration of interest for judges, and you may have seen some press coverage of that, which has resulted in myself and the Deputy Convener meeting the Lord President in a week or so. So the point I'm making is we're not discussing in private. Everything we do is open, and that's the reason that you're here along with your colleagues. So I'm delighted you are here, but just to make sure that's on the record.
If I could just clarify that, Convener, that my remarks were really predicated on past experiences with other committees, and I have watched your committee, in particular Jackson Carlo and co, with Lord Gill's refusal to attend, and I'm very impressed with that. And yes, you're certainly thorough in that respect. I'm basing it on my own experiences with other committees. But could I ask you, through the chair, why we have an additional submission to my petition, one from the Grand Lodge of Freemasons, but when I accepted your invitation, I put additional information forward from the Domstol, the Norwegian Courts Administration Service, and an article from the Guardian's political editor, and they don't appear in the...
Well, could I perhaps suggest what might be useful if I can ask some questions about your current petition and my colleagues can come in? Whilst I totally understand that there's some issues in the past that you wish to air, and you've done that very, very ably, our job is to look at the current position we're not really responsible for what happened in the past. We were very keen that we explore your petition. Now, you've touched on one of my questions very aptly, which was that you've mentioned the England and Wales situation where there was actually a registrar, as you said, from 1998 to 2009 in England and Wales. And as I understand it, that involved judges, police, prison staff, but also probation officers, which is quite interesting. And they were obviously asked to declare whether they were Freemasons. Have you been able to analyse what effectively the results of that period, because that's a fairly lengthy time, wasn't it? That was 98 to 2009. Have you looked at any academic evidence that's analysed how effectively that operated? Because one of the issues, sorry, partly to answer my own question, was that what I picked up was that for, I think from the effectively the equivalent of the Crown Office, was that they were sending a lot of nil returns back. There was a bit of an issue about that. But that's just one issue I want to raise. Perhaps you could give me your views on it, Mr Minogue.
Well, there was, as you say, a problem with lack of cooperation, particularly with Grand Lodge and with the judges themselves. But I think they got, in their overall conclusions, they decided that, you know, between 5 and 10%, this is on report 2 of the Home Affairs Committee, between 5 and 10% of the professional judiciary in England had declared Masonic membership. Now, if you can extrapolate that with the Scottish figures, which is a per capita, highest per capita Masonic membership in the world, more than 4 times what England has, you could be looking at between 22 and 44% of judges here being in organisations such as the Freemasons. But the requirement for England and Wales was ditched, and that's why I put the Guardian article to you, purely because there was an election looming, and Jack Straw, on his own, decided, after having been instrumental in introducing it, decided to scrap it as a vote catcher. And it wasn't anything to do with the 2 Italian cases that are quoted here. It was just, he actually produced a straw man of an argument and gave his reason for scrapping it as they hadn't found any evidence of criminality among judges. But the measures weren't brought in to find criminality among judges. The measures were brought in to reassure the public, to increase the public's confidence in the judiciary, not for any other reason. So it was scrapped on a whim with an election looming by a man who, just the other week there, apologised to the Hillsborough's family. He got it wrong for many years in that case. I suspect he got it wrong here.
My question was specifically, has there been any academic assessment of how effective that register was when it was operational for England and Wales?
Academic, I couldn't say. They seemed to like it. The Home Affairs Committee seemed to like it. And only Jack Straw, and in his power as Home Secretary, as I say, overturned it. So it wasn't, in my opinion, or to my knowledge, for any academic reason.
I think it was interesting to look at the analogies because, as you'll recall, it was actually recommended by a Westminster Select Committee to government and then accepted. So I was interested to see if there was any assessment on it. The other issue I just wanted to ask you specifically was, do you have any evidence of wrongdoing by Masons in public life through a non-declaration on any conflict of interest? Because that's probably of interest to the committee.
No. Of course, it's impossible for me to find out wrongdoing by people that don't admit to being members of it. So, no.
And obviously we have the petition, Mr Minogue, and please feel to get involved, Mr Barker, as well, in any questions or contributions.
Could I?
Yeah, do you want to come at this stage? And a final question for Mr Minogue.
Well, Accountability Scotland is about delivering effective administrative justice to Scotland. I don't have any concerns specifically with the Masons. I am much more concerned with the broader aspects of this, that Scotland is a village. People have relationships which can be damaging. I have been subject to one where a chief executive was a co-director with a contractor who had been appointed to a contract where he was unqualified. We need effective investigation. We need assurances that when you sit in front of a civil servant or an MSP, that they don't have a hidden agenda that is not available to us. And that's, we have examples of situations that have been covered up in the health service, in planning law and what have you. And that's why I'm supporting the broader aspect of Tom, who is a member of Accountability Scotland. We came to this rather late. It was only last Saturday that we attended the meeting and discussed this. So we're not perhaps up to speed on the Freemasonry, but Freemasonry is a metaphor for a much broader problem within Scotland.
Just one other point, Mr Minogue, before I ask you a very specific question. In terms of any additional papers that you may have that you wish us to have sight of, there was a point made about the Guardian article. I mean, there's not a problem with that. If there's been any problem with transmission, I apologise for that. If you send it through to Anne Pete, the clerk, that will be taken.
It was sent with, when I accepted the invitation of this committee,
well,
the links to the Domstall documents,
sure,
the Norwegian documents for judges, and the article by the Guardian political editor were with
sure,
that accepted.
Well, I'm apologies for any reason we haven't received it. The point I want to make clear is that we are very happy to look at any material you have. If you send that through to us, I will ensure that all the members see that and we can discuss it at any future meeting. I suppose the key point and the final point for me before I move on is we've obviously seen the petition. What would you say in a couple of sentences? What would you like this committee to do?
I would like this committee to examine the question of a conflict of oaths between the young man who, at 21 years old, is a young law student or whatever, and he follows his family tradition, and he goes and he joins the Masons. And that's fair enough. But it's an onerous business. He has a noose round his neck, he's blindfolded, he bares his breast, he rolls his trouser leg up, and he has a dagger pointed at his breast, and he swears to do certain things and to keep the secrets of that organisation. And he's under pain of having all sorts of horrible punishment. If he doesn't do that, he's going to get his tongue torn out. His body's going to be left to the sea to blow till the wind disintegrates. These are onerous things, and we take it at 20-year-old, a young lawyer would take that seriously. 40 years old, the same lawyer then gets the call to become a judge or a sheriff. Then he's asked to swear an oath to judge without fear or favour. Now, apologists for Freemasons would say, well, he's judging without fear and favour, so the previous sets of oaths, they don't matter. So what kind of man would take the oaths if he didn't mean it? And I see there's a conflict of oaths. There's a promise to prefer your brethren in the Masons that can't be simply dismissed because you become a judge. And I would personally see that as a problem. But my petition's not aimed as what Tom Minogue's worried about. I think people have the right to know if a judge who's sitting in judgment on them and another person, maybe balancing the evidence of two people, one a non-Mason and the other a Mason, is in fact a Mason, or is in fact a member of Opus Dei, or the Orange Order, or the British National Party, because I can see conflicts in some of the demands of these organisations. And this is where I'm coming from. And it's not a question that I just see it, because the two Home Affairs Select Committee reports tell you that all of England and Wales saw it at that time, and there was great public concern, and Parliament didn't spend all that time in it for nothing. And Norway and their government hasn't demanded membership of Freemasonry for nothing. And I would just make it clear that it's organisations such as Freemasons, because to me, you know, Freemasons they're a ubiquitous part of our natural culture. That's a fact. You know, one ex-Master Mason described them as part of the warp and weft of public life in Scotland. And I've drank in Masonic arms, I've attended weddings in Masonic halls, worked on bridges and buildings that have been inaugurated or consecrated, you know, with Masonic ceremonies. But I can't think of the last bridge I worked on that was dedicated by a senior official of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. And I haven't attended a wedding in the Knights of St Columba's Hall, and I'd be teetotal if I relied on getting a pint in the Opus Dei Arms. But if these organisations have similar demands on preferment or bias against people, then yes, of course I would want them to be introduced too. It's just as relevant an argument.
Thank you. I now bring some of my colleagues. John Wilson. Okay. Angus MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Mr Minogue. Good morning, Mr Stuart Bracker. You've made, and your petition makes a rather bold assumption that Freemasons demand fraternal preference to their brethren over non-brethren, and you go on to mention organisations which have constitutions or aims that are biased against any particular sect, religion or race. What proof do you have that Masons demand fraternal preference to their brethren over non-brethren, and what proof do you have that they are biased against any particular sect, religion or race?
Well, I can get my information. Obviously, I'm not a Freemason, so I haven't taken these oaths myself. So I get my information, as everybody else does, from libraries, from the internet, and from countries that, unlike Scotland, are not secretive about Freemasons, because I find Scotland are maybe very secretive and unique in other ways as well, Scottish Freemasonry. And no less a person than the Grand Secretary of Grand Lodge agreed with me on this point. He gave me a tour of the Grand Lodge, a nice chap called Martin McGibbon, C. Martin McGibbon. And we talked about the unique aspects of Scottish Freemasonry, which has got an orange flavour, got a sort of sectarian flavour, for historical reasons. And he told me about being in America and seeing bumper plates where it says, if you're a Mason, he said, I live in Glasgow, Tom. Imagine if I was to have one of these on in Glasgow. He says I'd have my car wrecked, because there is this unique sort of secretive nature in Scotland, which doesn't exist elsewhere. And I've heard it from English Masons as well about the sectarian aspect of it. They're shocked when they come to Scotland and there's this orange flavour about it. So I've learned about it from reading, and I've learned about it from the University of Life, from bitter experience. I've got negative views of Freemasonry. Some of the best people I've known in my life have been Freemasons, but my general experience in the engineering and construction industry is it's a corrosive influence. It's not a good influence, and that's where I've learned about it from as much as anything. But yes, when I was faced with the circumstances that I was tried, there was no doubt it was Freemasonry that was at the back of it. And logic was stood on its head, and I decided to look into it and challenge it, because I'd experienced it all my life, negative experiences, the very antithesis of meritocracy. I think it's a terrible thing, but that's only my view.
It's your view. You don't have proof, but on your point about openness, it would be helpful, just picking up on the convener's point, to get that document that you forwarded with regard to the operations in Norway. That would be helpful if we can get sent that. Well, we'll get it. Yeah. You'll also be aware, Mr Minogue, that of cases heard at the European Court of Human Rights, which you've already alluded to in your preamble, which would suggest that the introduction of a law, as you suggest, would breach the right to freedom of association, which is guaranteed in the Human Rights Act of 1998. Now, in addition, the EHCR held that treating membership of the Freemasons differently to non-secret societies was unjustified discrimination. So, if the Scottish Government or Parliament were to take on board your petition, would it not be breaching the European Court of Human Rights?
No, it wouldn't be, because that's not what those cases establish. And Jack Straw didn't rely on those cases. And Jack Straw who has a team of lawyers at his disposal as Home Secretary, never said that these two cases would have blown the legislation out of the water. He didn't say that. He didn't say that that's why he changed the rules and overturned them. He said that the United Grand Lodge of England's sabre-rattling with these two spurious Italian cases caused him to reconsider. And what caused him to change the rules was that he couldn't find any evidence of criminality amongst the judiciary. Do you want me to read that for you?
Convener.
Is it brief, Mr Minogue?
It's fairly brief. Jack Straw in the Parliament said, the review of his policy, which he carried out because of Grand Lodge's sabre-rattling, has shown no evidence of impropriety or malpractice within the judiciary as a result of a judge being a Freemason, not as a result of the 2 Italian cases. He found out that there was no impropriety, and in my judgment, therefore, it would be disproportionate to continue the collection or retention of this information because of that, because there was no evidence of impropriety, not because of 2 Italian cases, one of which, the second one, was even contested, and one of which banned Freemasons from certain jobs. Nobody's suggesting that.
The 2 Italian cases, surely you would accept that that these two rulings would cause the Scottish Government a problem. Okay, well...
Jack Straw didn't. No. Jack Straw didn't say, we're in trouble with these 2 cases. Jack Straw said, United Grand Lodge of England have said they might go for judicial review with these, but this has caused me to have a review. And when I do my review, it's the fact that there's no evidence of criminality in the judges. Jack Straw's created a straw man, funnily enough. He's created an argument that wasn't there as regards your Italian cases. The rules he overturned weren't taken to prove criminality among Freemason judges. They were there, and it's quite clear in the 2 Home Affairs Committee reports, to instill confidence in the public, in the judiciary. That's what they were there for, not to catch out crooked judges. So then to say, I'm scrapping them because we never caught out crooked judges, is a straw man argument.
Jackson Carlo.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr Minogue. Can I reassure you I have no vested interest in Freemasonry. I did, as a primary school, take an oath to the Tufty Club. I've never renounced Tufty. I hope that isn't going to compromise me. But the crucial thing when I took my oath to Tufty was it was not an oath in law. And as my understanding is, these Freemasonry, and I have some sympathy with some of the arguments that you mount, if not all, is that it's not an oath in law, whereas any judge is giving an oath in law, and I would have thought that took primacy over any more casually delivered oath. But I want to actually ask you specifically what the practical consequence might be of your petition. Because it says, litigant or plaintiff wishing to exercise their rights to a fair hearing. Is the implication thereby that if a judge was a Freemason, that would automatically invalidate the trial that took place? Or if the plaintiff was a Freemason and so was the judge, would that automatically render the verdict that subsequently was arrived at unsafe? And I'm trying to understand what the practical implication of it would be. And forgive me if I say the practical implication seems to me that it would just create chaos within our legal system. For an oath which is a casually delivered oath, and you actually articulated why I think part of the oath is in some sense a pantomime, in contrast to the very enforceable legal oath which judges and all those others involved in the criminal justice system take. And therefore, I'm uncertain as to whether the consequence of what you seek would not be complete chaos in relation to something that was not a legally enforceable declaration in the first place.
I don't think anyone would say that the judicial system in Norway is in complete chaos because they have a register of Freemason judges. And I don't think that the oath of a Freemason is, as you put it, a casual oath, because it's not done at all. Your word's casual. Casual isn't getting a dagger pointed at your breast and a noose round your neck. No, these things...
As far as I know, the dagger has never been plunged and the noose has never been pulled. So, I mean, to my mind, to my mind, it's all slightly ridiculous, but there is an element of theatre to it. I don't see it as as a legally enforceable thing. And to be fair to myself, Norway is not one of those countries I at least regularly point to as being a beacon of all hope and truth and justice in the world today. Others might.
But no, it's not a trivial thing. And I wouldn't trivialise it if you'd done and say it's just a piece of pantomime. And again, in my experience, I've seen Freemasons get away with virtually murder by dint of the fact that they're Freemasons in industry. So I see it as a powerful thing, and I see logic stood on its head when a Mason helps a Mason. And so I see it as quite a powerful thing. I don't think it would cause chaos, and I don't think it would invalidate every trial that was held, but it would help people like me. And people like me aren't, as Jim Wallace said, unique, because it was because of the overwhelming, the groundswell of concern in England about the Stalker affair, the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad, and now we've got policemen investigating the Hillsborough cover-up. They've banned Freemasons from that, so you're going to get another groundswell. And we continually get these, and you've got it in the Met at the minute with the press leaks. You've got public disquiet about Masons subverting the course of justice, and people like me would have the right, which I should have had when I went to trial, to ask if a judge had these obligations. Now, I don't say that I would always even object to a judge. In fact, if a judge wore it on his sleeve and said, I'm a Freemason and I don't care who knows it, I would maybe, because I have had many Freemason friends who have been very good friends and honest men, and I would say, well, OK, I'll put my trust in you. You're a man who wears it on your sleeve. It's this hidden element which, as I say, is peculiarly Scottish, as is the sectarian element peculiarly Scottish, and the massive numbers. So it's all of these things that cause me disquiet. And there are a lot of people like me. Well, I think the 3,116 who supported me in my petition obviously are evidence of that. And yes, I would feel a lot better if judges were open in all of their memberships. And I don't just include the Freemasons in this. Why shouldn't a judge... I could read, when I researched the Speculative Society, I looked at every judge we had, and over 2/3 of our judges were members of an all-male elite from Edinburgh University, the Speculative Society. Now, I could, when I researched that, I could look into these judges, I could tell if they were a member of the New Club, if they were which Burns Club they were a member of, or the Tufty Club, or whatever you like. But I never found out one who declared membership of the Speculative Society. And as soon as you see that, it causes you concern, because Kennedy made a great speech about secret societies and the distrust of secrecy, and it's true. Most people who are in these societies distrust them. They have a mistrust. And it's time in this day and age, in the 21st century, people having nooses tied around their neck, etc. You might say it's a bit of theatre, and making these promises. I don't see it's any place in a modern society. And if somebody's going to do that and pledge allegiance to their brother, then I'm entitled to know. And I'm not alone in this. And I think it was Lord Derry Irvine of Lairg, Lord Irvine, giving evidence to the 1998 Home Affairs Committee, said about this column of mutual aid that we all perceive Masons to have to help a brother in trouble. And he said, when people are in court, and he should know right enough, when people are in court, they usually are in trouble. So it's that side of it. And if I'm faced with somebody getting the benefit of this preferential treatment that a Mason gets, having the edge over me when comparing their evidence, then yes, I'm very concerned. And I would insist that if that was likely to happen in a case, then I would want to know. And of course, it might be that the case I didn't want to know, because say it was a divorce case. I've been married 44 years. Say my wife said, I'm getting rid of you. Now, my wife's from a Masonic tradition, as it happens. But if we went for a divorce case, I wouldn't say to the judge, I want to know if you're a Freemason, because you might favour her. Because, you know, that wouldn't be a concern of mine. So it would only be in certain instances where it would concern me. Each case would be individual and it wouldn't apply across the board.
John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr Minogue. Can I go back to what your petition says? The petition says, make it compulsory for decision makers such as sheriffs, judges, we've concentrated on judges at the present moment, and juries at their courts, arbiters and all panel members of tribunals that are convened and held in Scotland. Yeah. Now, this seems to extend beyond just judges and sheriffs. This seems to, because anyone can be called to serve on a jury. Yeah. So are you honestly saying that what you would want is everybody that sits in, either as an arbiter or as on a jury have to declare for the time that they're sitting on that jury that they're a member of an organisation such as the Masonic Order?
I think that people who sit on juries in certain cases, and it would be decided, I think, by the legal officials in the case, just like back to Jackson Carlos' question, it wouldn't affect across the board, no. But I didn't have this in my first petition, and I was persuaded by eloquent argument by the late Paul McBride QC speaking on Newsnight Scotland after the Neil Lennon assault case, where he described a completely and utterly inexplicable verdict, the man accused of assaulting Neil Lennon. And he said in Scotland, and I'm quoting him now, in Scotland we have juries who don't have to read, who don't have to write, they don't have to count, and may be full of prejudices, unlike other countries. We may have to visit this area again. So he's alluding to what I've already alluded to, the sort of the historical orange flavour of Freemasonry in Scotland, I think. Of course, I can't speak for him, the man dead, but that's what he said. These are his words. So it just struck me that you could have a jury who, leaving aside the illiteracy or numeracy or whatever, who were members of the British National Party. See, let's move away from the Freemasons. Members of the BNP, 15 members of the BNP, or a majority of a jury of the BNP members judging a black African asylum seeker. Would that be right or fair? And not only that, but as it stands at the minute, nobody can question the memberships of that jury. So when Neil Lennon, an Irish Catholic, was standing trial, I think it might have been fair if there had been a certain amount of jury vetting to see that maybe he wasn't tried in front of 12 Orangemen or 15 Orangemen. I can see it in certain circumstances. Of course, it could be the other way around. It could be a prominent Orangeman standing trial. And would it be right for him to be tried by 15 members of the Ancient Order of Hibernians? I think it's unlikely. All I'm saying is I picked up on what McBride said because in my previous petition I'd looked at my own case, decision maker in front of a sheriff, and the sheriff was the sole arbiter of my guilt or innocence. But I realised after hearing McBride, that's right enough. It's normally a jury. And I don't think it would apply every time, but yeah, why can't we ask a team of jurors? They do it in America. One of my supporters to the petition tells me they do it there all the time.
No, to go back to my original question, I raised the question about people having to make that declaration if they were sitting on a jury. And what you responded by saying is that law officers, only in certain cases, may make that decision. Now, is it only in certain cases we prescribe who can sit on a jury or who can hear a case? Or in terms of the petition that's before us, do you think it should be in all cases? Because you've went through a whole list of organisations and your answers in your opening statement, your answers today, including the Masons, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, Opus Dei, the Orange Order, Knights of St Columba. The only ones that you've not mentioned in terms of is Eastern Star. You haven't mentioned whether or not Church Elders. You did allude to it there. In terms of the Paul McBride interview that was on Newsnight in relation to the Neil Lennon case, that we may have a built-in bias in Scottish society that may predetermine the outcome of a judicial case based on the jury sitting there, 15 people, 15 peers judging a case that may have built-in bias. In terms of the BNP issue, though, if a member was sitting on a jury and was a member of the BNP and it was known to the court officials that that member was a member of the BNP, then I'd expect court officials to make the court aware of that, or the lawyers acting on that case to make the court aware of the membership of an organisation that has a particular leaning towards objections to colour or religious groupings. But when you start widening this out to include jurors, tribunals and other cases in Scotland, then effectively, who would sit in a jury?
I don't think I'm widening it out at all. I'm talking about juries and the ability to determine from a jury if they are members of organisations that have a bias, that demand a bias of their members, or have a bias against a group. Now, this is where I think that any body that looks at this would have to determine which groups fall into that category. And I don't know of many that would, and I don't think it's such a big thing to ask. Freemasons, Orange Order, BNP, Ancient Order of Hibernians, if that's necessary. I don't think that's a big thing to ask. And I think Paul McBride, and I was quoting Paul McBride because, yeah, I can't speak for him, but I did take on board what he says. That and if it went away from a petition, of course, the bigger thing is it can't be a good system where a man appearing, or a man or a woman appearing on a jury could be illiterate as well. So we aren't looking at a perfect thing here as far as jury goes. And I think that it's not unknown in America, for instance, that jury vetting is quite a big thing based on mainly race there. But so what? If we get a better justice system out of it, is it worth a bit of trouble?
My point is, who determines whether or not someone can sit in a court case, either as a juror or as the judge, a sheriff, or sit in a tribunal when they're hearing a case? Is in terms of the petition, who makes that decision? Because you're transferring, Mr Minogue, let me finish. You're potentially transferring power to someone else who, based on and Paul McBride isn't here to defend why he made the statement that he made on Newsnight in relation to Neil Lennon case. But clearly people who could view that interview will know that Paul McBride made comments that we were unable to question or examine what he meant by those comments. But society in terms of, and the point I'm making is in terms of juries and tribunals, people are asked to serve on these juries. People are drawn in from across society. Who determines whether or not they have a built-in prejudice in terms of hearing a case?
I think that let's say that the prosecutor, the procurator fiscal, or the defender, the counsel for those accused should have the right to ask for a declaration. But I didn't put a perfect document on here that's gone through a subordinate legislation committee and looked at all the small nuances you're putting here. I put a thing forward on a principle, and my principle still holds, and I shouldn't be asked to answer every administrative question about this at this point, surely.
Mr Minogue, the committee members are here to examine the petitions. We're at liberty to try and examine how we take a petition forward, or if we take a petition forward. And we need as much information as we possibly can get from the petitioner to assist us in determining how best to take this petition forward. That's the reason for the questions I've been asked today.
Thank you. We're a little bit short of time, but do any members who perhaps haven't asked a question wish to come in at this stage? At this stage, Mr Minogue, as you probably know from your watching of the previous committee events, that we have a summation section where the committee then decide what the next steps are. So if you could just bear with us for a few seconds. Members will know that there's a couple of options laid out in the clerk's report. One is to seek further information, which would continue the petition, and the second one was to take any other action under which the committee would seem appropriate. It would seem to me that certainly seeking further information on this would make sense. And there's a number of individual groups there, such as Scottish Government, the Lord President and so on, that we should write to. But are members agreeable we go down that course of action? John Wilson.
Convener, as well as the Scottish Government, the Lord President, Sheriffs Association, the Scottish Justice Association, can I suggest we also write to the Lord Advocate, Procurator Fiscal's Office and Police Scotland to get their views on the petition before us today?
Sorry, we're at the summation now. We need to. We're not allowed to have any further evidence. We need to. Jackson Carlo.
In seeking views, I'd actually quite like them to be sought in two respects. One, the desirability of the issues raised in the petition, and the other, the practicality of the issues raised in the petition, because I think they're quite distinct themes, and it may well be that they affect, our view when we finally consider this petition again.
We have, I think, agreed to write to the Grand Lodge of Scotland just to remind members that David Begg, who's the Grand Secretary, did offer to come in and give evidence before the committee. So I think it's my duty to make sure that members are aware of that offer. Obviously, it's up to members whether they wish to have oral evidence rather than written evidence. I'm frankly fairly neutral on this, but if members feel that it's important to bring Mr Begg in, I'm certainly happy to go along with that. But take members to you, Jackson Carlo.
I'd just like to reserve my position on that offer, I think, at this stage.
Right. John Wilson.
I'd like Jackson Carlo, Convener, I suggest we reserve our position and invite Mr Begg in at the present moment until we receive further evidence.
Right. Yeah. Other members?
Yes, I think, Convener, that's...
Alex McDonald?
I think, Convener, that's a sensible move at the moment, and I would just agree that there is merit in contacting all the bodies that have already been suggested this morning for their views.
Thank you. Anne McTaggart?
Particularly of the way forward that's been mentioned.
I'm happy to go with the recommendations.
Thank you. Remember, so Mr Minogue, we're going to continue with your petition, and we're going to write to the various organisations that you've heard various members mention, and we're not currently going to ask Mr Begg to give evidence. We're going to reserve a position on that. So we want the fullest possible information. Obviously, we'll keep you up to date with developments, and once we've had all the information back, the committee will obviously discuss that at a future date. And if I can just remind you of my earlier offer, I'm sorry if there's some communication problems, but any paperwork you have you want us to be aware of, please, probably the best bet is for you just to send this when you go home, and we'll ensure it will be circulated round all the members. I can also thank Peter Stewart-Blacker for coming along as well. It's very useful to get your views. And can I thank both gentlemen for coming in and giving evidence, and I suspend for 2 minutes to allow our witness to leave. Thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We start the committee. Agenda item 3 is consideration of current petitions. The next item of business is consideration of 12 current petitions. The first current petition is PE 1400 by Libby Anderson on behalf of One Kind on a ban on the use of wild animals in circuses. Members have a note by the clerk and the submissions. And can I apologise to Libby Anderson that we had to defer this item at our last meeting because we had a very full agenda. Can I have comments from members? Perhaps I could just confirm members are probably aware that the UK government intends to proceed with a full ban on all wild animals in circuses, and wild animals are obviously well recognised in legislation. I suppose one thought I had, I don't have a particular answer to this, but it's whether it's possible that we can in some way join in with a Westminster bill, because clearly Westminster, I think, are ahead of us in this, and they have made a clear intention. I think the Scottish Government intention's pretty clear as well. And it may be that we could write to Scottish Government and just confirm what sort of action they're doing, because I think it would probably speed up the process. John Wilson?
Convener, the one-kind response clearly in the third paragraph says developments south of the border suggest that we can no longer be confident, and assuming the UK Government will maintain its commitment to a full ban on wild animals in circuses, and a pre-rock legislative report by the Westminster EFRA Committee proposed that a ban might be confined to elephants and big cats. Now, clearly one kind in the response have raised concern that the ban might not go as far as we originally anticipated. And if we're writing to the Scottish Government, it might be useful to ask whether or not the Scottish Government are minded to go further than what is the indicative outcome of the discussions at UK level, and to go for a full ban on wild animals being used in circuses in Scotland.
Other members wish to contribute? Anne Taggart?
Really just to ask the Scottish Government, in light of the one-kind submission that we have received, what their view is in taking this forward.
Thank you. Just the clerk's just pointing out that we had a note, I think, from Libby Anderson, which said that the UK Government announced that it disagrees with the recommendation of the VFRA Committee to restrict its proposed ban on wild animals to big cat species and elephants.
Right. That's fine.
So I think it sounds to me that the UK Government is pretty much on the same page in the hymn sheet as the Scottish Government is. Jackson Carroll?
You said, Convener, that Westminster was ahead of the Scottish Government. Actually, when we'd considered this in April, that wasn't the case. It just seems that since April, the Scottish Government have kept their counsel to themselves in these matters. And I think that what we're really looking here to do is to prod rather sharply the Cabinet Secretary into declaring his hand and ensuring that, in fact, we don't find ourselves falling behind Westminster. There's no need for that to be the case, and I think this committee could serve a useful function by ensuring that focus is brought to bear on the issue with the government.
Mr Wilson, would you be...
My apologies, Convener. I was reading the submission from the 2nd of October, and thank you for reminding me of the submission from one kind on the 28th of October, which clearly updated the UK's position and would once again seek clarification for the Scottish Government as to the intention to follow the UK Government's clear intention to go for a full ban.
And just for information, I read something the weekend that the UK Government said that in England and Wales, in terms of numbers here, we're talking about 48 wild animals. That's the sort of scale of it. Not 48 circuses, but 48 wild animals in circuses in England and Wales. I don't have a Scottish figure for that. Are members agreeable then to Jackson Carroll's point that we write a sort of very straight note to the Scottish Government saying, can we please get some action on this particular point, and then we'll report back at a later stage once we've got a reply.
Agreed.
Are members agreeable? Thank you for that. If I move to the second current petition, is PE 1408 by Andrew MacArthur on the updating of pernicious anemia, vitamin B12 deficiency, understanding and treatment. Members are note by the clerk and the submissions. Could invite contributions from members. I would point out, obviously, the clerk's options, which are one, to defer consideration of this until next year following the publication of the guidelines by the British Committee for Standards in Haematology, or take any other action which the committee considers appropriate. Certainly the first one seems fairly sensible. If members are agreeable, I would recommend it. Thank you.
The only
John Wilson?
The only rider convener would be to ask if you could write to the British Committee for Standards in Haematology to find out. The report says mid-2014. It would be useful to try and get a more specific date from the committee in relation to when they expected it, because I know that they have went into more detail and they've found the work greater than what they originally anticipated, and I welcome the fact that they're doing the work on this research, but it would be useful if we could get a clear indication when the report is likely to be published.
Agreeable? Thank you. Can I move to the third current petition? 14112 by Bill McDowell on bonsification. Members have a note by the clerk and submissions. Your note again, a couple of the options. The first is to ask the Scottish Government for its views on the petitioner's suggestion that the categories of executor to which a bondification is required be restricted, and for an update on its work on succession law. I've picked up probably this is not perhaps a top priority for government. I think it's a fair summary, but nevertheless I do think it's important we find out what the Scottish Government's view on the petitioner's suggestion may be. Do any members have any points? Are members agreeable on? Right, thank you for that. The fourth current petition is PE 1421 by Gail Robertson on behalf of the Outer Hebrides Transport Group on fair ferry fares. Members have a note by the clerk and submissions. Members will know, I think I mentioned previously that on my regional hat I've met Gail Robertson, who I think it's fair to say really has been leading the campaign in the Western Isles. She's got a great knowledge of the commercial vehicles industry, but also has done a lot of campaigning on this issue. She sent a note through, I think it was only to myself, but I'm happy for subsequent meetings to get that note round to all members. I think her position is she still feels this is a huge issue in the Western Isles. My assessment, and other members will keep me right on this, but my assessment of the Scottish Government view is, although it's obviously looking at an extension of RET, I don't see lots of evidence of it changing its view on the impact of changing its view on its ruling for commercial vehicles. However, there's clearly been a big impact on this, but one suggestion is that under Rule 50.7 that we actually we close the petition but ask that Transport Scotland keep closely in touch with the petitioner. If members have any other options for any other way forward, I would certainly welcome that. I think the petitioner's view, I think it's fair to say, is there's still unfinished business. I think that would be a fair summary, I think, of review. Angus Robertson, I know, Angus MacDonald, you've obviously had a lot of knowledge from your Western Isles background. Would you care to comment on this?
Yes, thanks, Convener. As far as I'm aware, I know that the Transport Minister has identified extra funding to assist the hauliers, and that has been publicly announced. So, while it may not go as far as the petitioners would like, it's still assisting hauliers to keep the costs down. So on that basis, I'd be happy to go with a recommendation to close the petition. However, also enforcing that Transport Scotland do ensure that the working group consults with the petitioner, who is a key stakeholder.
Sorry, apologies. The clerk advises me that, in fact, everybody got a copy of Gail Robertson's note. So, sorry, you should actually have that in front of you. I think probably the point coming out from the email was that there was, I think there was a meeting with the group, that's the Outer Hebrides Commerce Group and Keith Brown, and I think there's still some follow-up requested from Mr Brown. So if it's competent, I would certainly like to ask Mr Brown if he's able to get back to the group and confirm the points that they raised. Angus,
at the same time as closing the petition.
Yes, that's competent. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And any other members wish to comment? That's a comment. Right. Well, can I thank Gail Robertson for the petition, and we will ask the Minister to chase up the various points that we raised. But under Rule 15.7, on the basis that the study and the impact of the removal of RETs be conducted, we'll ask that we close this petition. Is that agreeable? Right. Thank you for that. If I now move to the fifth current petition, which is PE 1431 by Nick Ridderford on behalf of the Fair Isle community on marine protected areas for Fair Isle. Members have a note by the clerk and submissions. And again, apologies, we had to defer this at the last meeting. As I understand it from the last preparation I did for the last meeting, that Marine Scotland are actually very happy to give evidence in 2014. Some of the longer serving members will be here when we took evidence from the Fair Isle community. But I think it would make sense to defer consideration of the petition once the final assessment of the Fair Isles demonstration research proposal has taken place. Agreed. That would be agreeable? Thank you. If we move to the sixth current petition, it's PE 1461 by William Campbell on protection for third parties in the planning process. Members have a note by the clerk and submissions. Just to remind members, I think again at the last meeting I want to draw members' attention to the fact that I have met Mr Campbell a number of times for various constituency matters, so I know Mr Campbell personally, and I know that Mary Scanlon had an interest in this case, but I don't think she's able to attend today. Clearly, the key point is that where there are issues, where there's any intimidation referred to in the planning process, clearly that is a matter for police, and I don't think Mr Campbell or anyone else is disputing that. But I think his key points was that he wished to change Scottish planning policy, and he wanted the Justice Secretary to see the petition. That was his key sort of issues around that. And members will note that there's been Police Scotland have now set up a new counter-corruption unit for public sector corruption, which I think would have some impact on his petition as well. But with that part, I'd ask members for further views. John Wilson.
Can I suggest we keep this petition open, that we write to the Scottish Government and ask the Scottish Government to respond to the latest submission from the petitioner. Got a particular issue in relation to the fact that where there is a third party involved in a planning application who faces harassment and intimidation by an applicant, that there is the only recourse is to go to the police and for police action, and that there is no, under the present regulations, there are nothing there to stop the planning committee from considering the planning application, despite the fact that a third party may be facing harassment and intimidation from an applicant, and to seek assurances from the Scottish Government whether or not they would consider the situation in relation to halting a planning application from consideration by a local authority where it has been found that there is legitimate claims that harassment and intimidation has been taking place by a planning applicant in the process. Because clearly, if someone feels they are being intimidated and harassed, if they go to the police, the planning application still goes ahead. So irrespective of any harassment or intimidation that takes place, the planning application can be considered and approved by a local authority without any reference to the actions of the planning applicant towards third parties or neighbours.
Thank you for that. Angus MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, I think there is merit in John Wilson's suggestion. Perhaps we wouldn't be in this situation had a previous administration prior to 2007 got rid of the third-party right of appeal. But that's possibly for another day.
Your point is made, Mr MacDonald. Do other members wish to contribute? So, are members agreeable with Mr Wilson's suggestion? Right. Thank you for that. If I can move to the seventh current petition, which is PE 1467 by Andrew McGowan, member of the Scottish Youth Parliament, on behalf of the Scottish Youth Parliament on a Scottish Living Wage Recognition Scheme. Members have a note by the clerk. Just out of interest, I would like to flag up that I actually spoke to a group on Friday, and Andrew McGowan was one of the speakers, and he was actually congratulating the committee on the way that handled these petitions. So I just want to pass that congratulations on to the committee. I know actually that I think it was at the SNP conference that there was a potential manifesto commitment to have effectively a Scottish Living Wage Recognition Scheme. It's not called exactly that, but it was the same as that. So it sounds to me there's certainly some movement around that. I think there's some issues around reserved versus devolved powers, but there was, I think, a suggestion that we ask the Scottish Government what plans it has to fund the Poverty Allowance, and I said I would just stress that the Government looks like it's going to adopt this. John Wilson.
Convener, I note the statement that's been made by the petitioner, Mr McGowan, in relation to the quote that he used in the second paragraph. And the quote says, "The Government will fund the Poverty Alliance to deliver a living wage accreditation scheme to promote the living wage and increase the number of private companies that pay for it." Now, to promote the accreditation scheme is different from funding the Poverty Alliance. And I should declare an interest here as a former employee of the Poverty Alliance. I would seek, when we write to the Scottish Government, I would seek clarification from the Scottish Government as to whether or not it is about funding the accreditation scheme. Now, an accreditation scheme, as I understand it, and it's in operation, is something that helps promote amongst employers the introduction of the living wage, and employers receive accreditation from the living wage campaign for that work and the promotion and delivery of the living wage. So it was just to clarify from the Scottish Government whether or not it would be funding for the Poverty Alliance, or is it funding for the Poverty Alliance accreditation or the living wage campaign accreditation scheme, because the Poverty Alliance is an organisation amongst others who are involved in the living wage campaign in Scotland, including STUC, several unions, the churches in Scotland, and other interested organisations. So it's just to get that clarification from the Scottish Government before we move forward.
Members agreeable? Thank you for that. Can I move to our 8th current petition, is PE 1471, by Rachel McCulley, a member of the Scottish Youth Parliament, on behalf of the Scottish Youth Parliament on Young People's Hospital Wards. Members have a note by the clerk. Can I invite contributions from members? And there is some possible options for action. Just to prompt the committee, the one possible action is that we write to the Scottish Government in the terms of the paragraph that's down in options, which is ask about ensuring staff are appropriately trained lies with NHS health boards, and there were some specific actions there which would require to ensure that all staff routinely deal with young people had appropriate training. Members agreeable way forward? Jackson Carlow.
If we must, Convener, I mean, I have to say I think we're stretching the elastic. I would certainly say that in doing so, that would be our final action prior to closing the petition, because I think we've received some pretty comprehensive response from all of this on the principal request of the petition, which was the establishment of these wards. So, yes, if that is our final action in respect to the petition.
I take the member's point. Thank you for that. The 9th current petition is PE 1472 by Councillor Gordon Murray and Councillor Ray Mackenzie on behalf of Protect Inter-Island Transport Links on Inter-Island Air Services. Members have a note by the clerk submissions. Members who were there, which were most, will remember that this was one of our away day, Parliament Day and Stornoway issues, and we're looking for possible actions. There's certainly, I think, I would certainly find it helpful to have the Minister for Transport and Veterans to give evidence on the issue of PSO air service to Highlands and Islands. That's particularly, there's part of a wider strategy here that may well fit into that. John Wilson and then Angus McDowell. Angus McDowell.
The problem I have with that, Convener, is that the PSO, Inter-Island PSO service is the responsibility of the Western Isles Council.
That's right.
And we got that from both the leader and the convener when they were here prior to the recess. So I would be minded to close the petition on the basis that the Scottish Government stated that it has no plans to review the number and range of air services subject to PSOs, and I would see there is little point in asking the Minister to attend when that position has clearly been stated.
I would certainly agree with Angus McDowell. I met the Minister, and I think it's clear your interpretation of the policy is the one I would agree with. John Wilson.
Convener, I'm not minded to close the petition. What I would like to do is that, and Angus MacDonald's raised an interesting point about Western Isles Council as a responsible authority for this. I'm rather concerned that NHS Western Isles, in terms of the response on page 1 of their letter, which says that NHS Western Isles has not been asked specifically to participate in work in relation to economic studies. And it would be just to get clarification from Western Isles Council about what consultations and engagement they've had with other stakeholders in the Western Isles who relied on these services prior to making the decisions that they've made. Because it's okay to say that, no, on one hand, the Western Isles Council are saying it's the Scottish Government that are responsible. When we know it's the Western Isles Council, but it would be useful just to get clarification in relation to the wider implications of the decisions that have been made by Western Isles Council and other, because the NHS Western Isles have indicated that the travel times and the costs have significantly increased because of the decisions made. But it would be just useful to see if there were clearly implications.
And members will probably recall that the service from Stornoway to Benbecula and Benbecula to Barra were quite heavily used by patients,
Yeah.
and getting to Stornoway is quite crucial. So on a Friday, for example, there's no flight. A doctor was telling me there's no flight from Benbecula to Stornoway, and that's the day the stroke clinic's on Stornoway, so they can't get the patient there. So there is, John Wilson's right to say there certainly is a health component. I'm not suggesting that health don't have any statutory responsibility to fund this. That's fairly clear. But there's certainly caused dislocation in Western Isles not having that frequency of service.
It's also, Convener, I would contend that about the preventative spend agenda that's supposed to take place between services across Scotland, including the health service and local authorities. And if a decision's been made by the council without consultation with other particular stakeholders, and I think your example, the stroke clinic, is one whereby that has a serious impact on the health and well-being of residents on some of the remoter islands. And did Western Isles Council take that into consideration when they decided to make the decisions they did?
Charles Carlow, you're looking.
We've written to the government who've said, which is what we were asked to do by the petition, who've said no, they're not going to. We've had the relevant council here who have told us that it's the responsibility of the council and they're not going to. We're not going to be able to meet the request of the petitioners any further. So whilst all this is very interesting, I've no doubt, I don't see how it advances the petition, because we have a response from the government and we have had a response from the council who are responsible for the matter as far as the government are concerned. So this is navel-gazing on our part. I don't see what the relevance of it is. It's for others to follow these matters through, not us.
Okay. And David Torrance? Okay. Alma Taggart?
There's still unfinished business, and I hear what Jackson Carlow has just said, but I mean, whose responsibility would it be then if it wasn't our responsibility to ensure that the questions that John Wilson most certainly asked are answered? Could I ask the clerk?
Well, in terms of the answer, I mean, obviously we have it. Obviously local councillors do have a responsibility, and local members for that area have a responsibility to pursue it, and of course regional members as well. I think what we've got is a position where a couple of members are certainly suggesting we should close. I think John Wilson was suggesting we should pursue the health board in terms of unfinished business.
My pursuit would want to pursue the council, Convener, because
Right.
based on the NHS Western Isles response, there clearly are unintended consequences of the decisions that they've made, and one of those unintended consequences is your example of the stroke clinic patients being denied the opportunity, or having to find alternative methods to get to attend these clinics, which is really has an impact on, as I said earlier, the health and well-being of the.
Yeah. Doug, could I just go back to you? I mean, my take from your earlier conversations, you were in favour of closure. Is that correct?
Yeah. I was, but,
but I'm not putting words in your mouth. So do.
I do take on board John Wilson's point. I mean, the wording of the petition does state, and it calls on the Scottish Parliament to consider the impact on local communities by withdrawal of the service, the air service. So, you know, that there has been an impact, as we're hearing. Given that people from the Southern Islands can't get up to the stroke.
Is there a perhaps solution? I think we did this with the previous one, that there is a tiny bit of unfinished business that we need to write to, but basically we could close the petition, but in doing so we would write to the local authority to seek clarification at one point. We did that with the previous petition. I think that's competent. How would you... Would that be competent? Yeah. And that way, I think that meets needs of both sides of the committee.
But do members not wish to consider the response?
Yeah, I mean, there is the issue about how we consider response. I think there's a clear move to the petition being closed, and there's a bit of unfinished business. That at least completes it all. I think if there's anything further from that, we can see whether we need to push that on to any other committee that's looking at this issue. Would that be agreeable?
Yeah.
Thank you for that. The 10th current petition is PE 1484 by Ian Tho on an independent regulator for national examinations set by Scottish Qualifications Authority. Members have note by the clerk submissions. There is a suggestion that we close the petition in Rule 15.7 on the basis that the Scottish Government has considered the 2 points set out in the petition and it has stated does not intend to take the action sought by the petitioner.
Well, I think that's nearly final.
Thank you.
We can agree.
I think that's a yes from Jackson Carlo. So,
I think, convener, it's not for us to thereby say what our preferences as a committee, as individuals, if it were. I mean, it's a fairly unequivocal response from the government, and therefore I think that leads us in one direction.
That's true. So it's unanimous to be closed petition. The 11th current petition is PE 1485 by David Ewing on airgun licensing in Scotland. Again, members have the note by the clerk and submissions. There's a number of possible options. It's suggested that the committee close the petition on the grounds that the Scottish Government consulted on the proposals earlier in the year and the petitioner responded to the consultation. The new licensing bill will be introduced during the course of this Parliament year, which will provide a further opportunity for people to make their views known as part of the legislative process. Is that agreeable? Yeah. Thank you. And the 12th and final petition is PE 1487 by Mark Gordon and Secular Scotland on religious and services in schools. Members have a note by the clerk and submission. And could I just remind members that there's been some additional papers there. In particular, I think it came from St Louis and St Matthew's schools. There were some extra papers that I saw. I think Mark Gordon also had one as well, if I remember correctly. So I'd invite contributions from members, and just to remind members, there's probably two main options. We can write to the Scottish Government asking to respond to the points and evidence presented by the petitioner and ask how it ensures that parents are informed of the right to opt out and the suitable alternative activities that are arranged. That was the point made very strongly by Mr Gordon's evidence. To refer the petition in Rule 15.6.2 to the Education and Cultural Committee as part of its remit, or of course look at any other action that the committee would consider appropriate. Could I have members' views? Jackson Carlo?
Well, I don't think the committee would thank us very much for simply passing it on in its current form. So at the very least, I think we should write to the Scottish Government, as is suggested, for clarification on those points.
Thank you for that. And the target?
It was really just to ask, are we aware of what is on the agenda for the Education and Cultural Committee at this stage? I mean, is it something that they have been looking at or are due to look at?
I don't think it's in the work programme. Normally the clerks discuss all of these things, and if there's something active, we're told. So I'm not picking up there's anything active under that committee at that stage. But I take Jackson Carlo's point. We normally try and go to the end of the earth with these petitions, so I don't think we've fulfilled that at this stage. John Wilson?
I would agree. We write to Scottish Government seeking their views on the submissions that have been made to date. Convener?
Are all members agreeable with that course of action? Well, thank you very much. We're going to continue that petition, and we'll obviously be discussing that at a future date. Could I formally close the meeting and allow a few seconds for members in the gallery to leave? I've just got a couple of administrative things I wanted to speak to the committee about, if we could just hold on.